Humphrey Bogart was dying. Everyone knew it. The cancer that had taken his esophagus, his ability to eat, was now taking everything else. Bogie, the toughest guy in Hollywood, was 57 years old, gaunt, barely 80 pounds. When he walked into rooms, which he rarely did anymore, people would gasp. They'd stare at him with pity. They'd speak to him in soft, careful voices like he was already a ghost, and it was killing him almost as much as the cancer. Humphrey Bogart didn't want pity. He didn't want sadness. He didn't want people treating him like he was already dead. Then Frank Sinatra came to visit. Frank walked into Bogie's house, looked at him, this man who'd lost nearly 100 pounds, who could barely stand, and said, "Jesus, Bogie, you look like hell. What happened? You stopped drinking scotch?" Bogart stared at Frank for a moment. Then he started laughing, real laughing, the kind that comes from relief, because Frank Sinatra had just given him something nobody else would. Normalcy. No pity, no sadness, just two old friends giving each other shit. And in that moment, Humphrey Bogart wasn't a dying man. He was Bogie, and Frank knew that's exactly what his friend needed. To understand the significance of Frank Sinatra's final visit to Humphrey Bogart, you need to understand who these men were to each other, and you need to understand what it means to watch a legend die. Frank Sinatra and Humphrey Bogart met in the late 1940s, but their real friendship began in 1953. That was the year Frank was at rock bottom. His voice had failed him. Columbia Records had dropped him. His movie contract with MGM was terminated. Ava Gardner had left him. He was broke, humiliated, finished, and Humphrey Bogart gave him a lifeline. Bogie championed Frank for the role of Maggio in From Here to Eternity. He told people in Hollywood that Frank could act, that he deserved a chance. When most of Hollywood had written Frank off, Bogie stood by him. Frank never forgot that. After From Here to Eternity and Frank's comeback, the two men became genuinely close. Not just Hollywood friends who smiled for cameras, but real friends who actually enjoyed each other's company. Bogie and his wife Lauren Bacall would have Frank over to their house in Holmby Hills. They'd drink scotch. Bogie always scotch, Frank his Jack Daniels. They'd play word games. Bogie loved word games. He was incredibly well-read, sharp as hell, could quote Shakespeare and argue about politics for hours. Frank loved that about him. Bogie didn't treat Frank like Frank Sinatra, the singer. He treated him like an equal, an intellectual, someone whose opinions mattered. They'd argue about everything: movies, politics, books, baseball. Bogie was a liberal, though not as vocal about it as some. Frank was still finding his political footing in those days. They'd debate for hours, neither one backing down, both loving every minute of it. Bogie was part of the famous Holmby Hills Rat Pack, the original Rat Pack, before Frank's version. It was Bogie and Bacall as the king and queen, with Frank, Judy Garland, David Niven, and a rotating cast of others. They'd meet at Bogie's house, drink, laugh, be themselves away from the cameras and the studio executives. Bogie became something of a mentor to Frank, though neither would have used that word. Bogie wasn't the mentoring type, and Frank wasn't the student type, but Frank watched how Bogie carried himself, the way he didn't kiss ass, the way he stood his ground with studio heads, the way he chose his roles based on what he wanted to do, not what would make the most money. Frank learned from that. After his comeback, Frank started applying Bogie's principles to his own career: control, independence, do it your way. By 1954, when Frank was back on top and Bogie was still making great films like The Caine Mutiny and Sabrina, they were as close as two men in Hollywood could be. By late 1956, Bogie had been through hell. In February 1956, he'd been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. The prognosis was grim. The cancer was aggressive. Treatment options were limited. Bogie underwent surgery. They removed part of his esophagus. The surgery was brutal. Bogie lost massive amounts of weight. His once solid 5-foot 8-inch frame, which had typically carried 165 pounds, was now down to barely 80. Bogie looked like a skeleton. His face was gaunt. His clothes hung off him. His famous tough guy swagger was gone, replaced by the slow, careful movements of a very sick man. But Bogie wasn't ready to die. He was stubborn. He was Humphrey Bogart, goddammit, and Humphrey Bogart didn't quit. So even though he was clearly dying, Bogie kept up appearances. He'd have people over occasionally. He'd try to maintain some semblance of normal life. He wanted to show the world, and himself, that he was still here, still fighting, still Bogie. But it was exhausting. Every visitor who came to see Bogie came with the same energy, sadness, pity, careful kindness. They'd arrive at his house in Holmby Hills with tears in their eyes. They'd hug him gently like he might break. They'd say things like, "You're so brave," and "You're an inspiration," and "We're praying for you." Bogie appreciated their kindness. He really did. But what he wanted, what he desperately needed, was for someone to treat him like he wasn't dying, to treat him like he was still Bogie, still the tough, sardonic bastard who takes shit from nobody. By December 1956, Bogie was spending most of his time in bed. The cancer was winning. He could barely eat. The pain was constant. Morphine helped, but it also made him foggy, disconnected. Lauren Bacall stayed by his side. She was 32 years old, watching her 57-year-old husband waste away. It was devastating. Their close friends came to visit. John Huston, the director who'd made Bogie a star, would sit by his bedside and tell stories. Spencer Tracy would stop by. Katharine Hepburn came. They all meant well, but they all treated Bogie the same way, like he was dying, because he was. Early January 1957, Frank Sinatra called the Bogart house. Frank had seen Bogie a few weeks earlier at a small gathering. He'd seen what everyone else saw, a man who was clearly in his final days, and Frank decided he needed to visit his friend. But Frank didn't call to ask how Bogie was feeling, didn't offer prayers or sympathy. Frank called and said, "Bogie, I'm coming by tomorrow. Make sure you're awake and not dead or anything inconvenient like that." Bacall, who'd answered the phone, heard Bogie laugh from the bedroom. Actually laugh. She couldn't believe it. Bogie hadn't really laughed in weeks. The next day, Frank showed up at the Bogart house in Holmby Hills. Bacall answered the door. She looked at Frank with sad eyes, started to say something about Bogie's condition. Frank cut her off gently. "Is he awake?" "Yes, but Frank, he's very weak." "Then let's not waste time." Frank walked past Bacall into the house. He found Bogie in the bedroom, propped up on pillows, wrapped in a robe that used to fit him but now looked 3 sizes too big. Bogie looked up when Frank entered. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Frank saw what everyone else had seen, his friend reduced to a shadow of himself. Bogie saw something in Frank's eyes too, but it wasn't pity, it was recognition. Like Frank was looking past the disease and seeing the man underneath. Then Frank said, "Jesus, Bogie, you look like hell. What happened? You stopped drinking scotch?" Bacall, standing in the doorway, held her breath. "You couldn't say things like that. Bogie was dying. You had to be gentle, supportive, careful." But Bogie stared at Frank for a long moment. Then his face broke into a huge grin and he started laughing. Deep, genuine laughter. "Screw you, Frank," Bogie said, still laughing. "I'll drink you under the table even like this." "With what? That feeding tube?" "I've seen better drinkers at a church social." Bogie laughed harder. "Get over here, you bastard." Frank walked over and sat down in the chair next to Bogie's bed. Not too close, not hovering like a nurse, just sitting like they'd done 100 times before at parties and dinners and late-night conversations over the past 10 years. And for the next 2 hours, Frank Sinatra gave Humphrey Bogart the greatest gift anyone had given him in months: normalcy. Frank didn't ask how Bogie was feeling. He didn't mention cancer. He didn't talk about treatments or doctors or prognosis. He didn't say anything that acknowledged Bogie was dying. Instead, Frank told stories. He talked about a terrible comedian he'd seen in Vegas who couldn't get a laugh if his life depended on it. He gossiped about which Hollywood marriages were really in trouble. Turns out most of them. He complained about the new younger actors who didn't know how to hold themselves on camera. Bogie listened and occasionally interjected with his own stories and opinions. They argued about which directors were actually worth a damn. Frank said John Huston was overrated. Bogie called Frank an idiot. They both laughed. Frank told a dirty joke about a sailor and a showgirl that Bogie had probably heard before but still found funny. Bogie tried to tell one back, but started coughing halfway through. Frank waited patiently, then finished the joke for him, deliberately getting the punchline wrong. Bogie corrected him, and they argued about the proper way to tell a dirty joke. At some point, Frank pulled out a flask of Jack Daniels. "You drinking?" Frank asked. Bogie's doctors had forbidden alcohol, the medication, the cancer. Everything said no drinking. Bogie looked at the flask. "What the hell? I'm dying anyway." Frank poured a small amount into a glass. Bogie took a sip, couldn't really swallow it properly anymore. But the taste, God, the taste of whiskey. Something normal, something from before. "That's terrible whiskey," Bogie said. "You're terrible whiskey," Frank shot back. They both laughed. At no point did the conversation turn serious. At no point did Frank's face show sadness or pity. He treated Bogie exactly as he always had. with irreverent humor, casual affection, and complete acceptance. Lauren Bacall watched from the doorway at one point. She later said, "I saw Bogie laugh more in those 2 hours with Frank than he had in the previous 2 months. Frank wasn't careful with him. He wasn't gentle. He was just Frank. And that's exactly what Bogie needed." After about 2 hours, Frank stood up. "All right, Bogie, I gotta get going. I've got a recording session." "A recording session?" Bogie asked, smiling. "What are you recording? More of that crooning garbage?" "That crooning garbage pays better than your tough guy act ever did." Bogie laughed. "Get out of here, you bum." Frank started walking toward the door, then turned back. For just a moment, one brief moment, his cool facade cracked. His eyes met Bogie's, and there was something there. Recognition, love, grief, all the things Frank hadn't said out loud. "Bogie," Frank said quietly. "Yeah." Frank wanted to say so many things. He wanted to say, "I'm going to miss you. I'm sorry this is happening. Thank you for your friendship. You're one of the best men I've ever known." But Frank knew that saying those things would shatter the gift he'd just given Bogie. It would turn the visit into a goodbye. It would acknowledge what both men knew but neither wanted to admit. So instead, Frank said, "Try to eat something, would you? You're making the rest of us look fat." Bogie grinned. "Get out of here before I throw something at you." Frank left. He walked out of Bogie's house, got in his car, and drove away. And he never saw Humphrey Bogart alive again. Bogie died on January 14th, 1957, just days after Frank's visit. The cancer had finally won. Bogie's final hours were painful and difficult.
He was in and out of consciousness. Lauren stayed by his side. Their children were there. Hollywood mourned. At Bogie's funeral, Frank Sinatra was there. He stood alongside Spencer Tracy, John Huston, and other Hollywood legends. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The grief was too much. After the funeral, Lauren Bacall pulled Frank aside. "Thank you for that last visit," she said, tears in her eyes. "I didn't do anything," Frank said. "You did everything. You gave Bogie 2 hours where he wasn't dying, where he was just Bogie, hanging out with his friend Frank. Do you know how rare that was? How precious?" Frank couldn't speak, just nodded. "Everyone else who came," Bacall continued, "they came to say goodbye. They came to tell him how much he meant to them. They came to cry and hug him and make peace. And Bogie appreciated all of it, but it was exhausting. It reinforced that he was dying, that he was leaving, that people were already mourning him while he was still alive." She took Frank's hand. "You didn't do that. You came and gave Bogie 2 hours where he wasn't a dying man. He was just Bogie. You joked, you laughed, you talked about stupid things that didn't matter. And in doing that, you gave Bogie something more valuable than any goodbye. You gave him his dignity. You gave him normalcy. You gave him 2 hours of feeling alive instead of feeling like he was already dead." Frank wiped his eyes. "He was my friend." "I know, and you were his. The way you treated him that day, that's real friendship." Years later, Lauren Bacall wrote about that visit in her memoir. She said, "Frank Sinatra's final visit to Bogie was one of the most loving things I've ever witnessed. After Frank left, Bogie said to me, 'That's the first time in months someone's treated me like a man instead of a patient.' He had tears in his eyes, but he was smiling." Frank had given him a gift that nobody else could. The story of Frank Sinatra's final visit to Humphrey Bogart is about more than just 2 Hollywood legends. It's about what it means to truly love someone who's dying. Most people, when they visit someone who's terminally ill, come for themselves. They come to say goodbye so they'll have closure. They come to express their feelings so they won't have regrets. They come to make peace so they can move on. Frank didn't come for himself. He came for Bogie. He came to give Bogie what Bogie needed, not what Frank needed. And what Bogie needed wasn't tears or goodbyes or sympathy. Bogie needed to feel like Bogie one last time. That's real friendship. That's real love. Not making it about your feelings, but about what the other person needs. Not saying what you want to say, but doing what needs to be done. Frank Sinatra could have walked into Bogie's house and cried. He could have told Bogie how much their friendship meant to him. He could have said a proper goodbye, and Bogie would have understood. Bogie would have appreciated it. But Frank knew that Bogie had already heard all of that from everyone else. What Bogie hadn't heard, what Bogie desperately needed, was someone treating him like he wasn't dying. So Frank gave him that gift, and it was the greatest act of friendship and compassion that anyone showed Humphrey Bogart in his final days. Bogie's death hit Frank hard, harder than most people knew. Frank didn't talk about it much. That wasn't his style. He didn't do public grieving, didn't give interviews about his feelings.
kept it locked inside, but those close to him saw it. In the weeks after Bogie died, Frank would be in the middle of recording a song and suddenly stop, just stop, stare into space. His pianist, Bill Miller, knew. Frank was thinking about Bogie. Frank couldn't watch Bogie's movies for months, couldn't even hear his name without feeling the loss. When Casablanca came on television, Frank would leave the room. Dean Martin, who'd become one of Frank's closest friends by then, saw the grief. Frank took Bogie's death harder than almost anything I'd seen. He'd lost people before. His career had died and come back. His marriage to Ava was killing him, but losing Bogie was different. Bogie represented something to Frank: integrity, strength, the kind of man Frank wanted to be. One night, a few weeks after Bogie died, Frank was drinking alone in his apartment. Dean stopped by, found Frank sitting in the dark with a bottle of Jack Daniels and a photograph of Bogie from one of their parties. "You okay, Pally?" Dean asked. Frank didn't look up. "He was 57, Dean. 57. That's nothing. He should have had another 20 years. I know. And you know what kills me? The last time I saw him, I didn't say it. Didn't tell him what he meant to me. Didn't say goodbye." Dean sat down next to Frank. "You gave him something better than goodbye." Frank looked at him. "You gave him 2 hours of being Bogie instead of being a dying man. That's worth more than any goodbye. You think Bogie wanted to hear one more person tell him they'd miss him? He wanted what you gave him. Normalcy, dignity, his friend treating him like a friend." Frank nodded. "I hope you're right. I am right." And Bogie knew. He knew how you felt. You didn't need to say the words. For months after, Frank would do small things to keep Bogie's memory alive. He'd order scotch at bars instead of his usual Jack Daniels. For Bogie, he'd say to whoever was with him. He'd watch Bogie's movies when he was alone, even though it hurt. He'd tell stories about Bogie at parties, keeping him alive in conversation. And he never forgot that final visit. Never regretted doing it the way he did. The lesson of Frank Sinatra's visit to Humphrey Bogart isn't about death. It's about dignity. It's about seeing past the disease to the person underneath. It's about giving people what they need, not what you think they should need. It's about understanding that when someone is dying, the kindest thing you can do isn't always to acknowledge it. Sometimes the kindest thing is to pretend, just for a little while, that everything is normal, that your friend is still your friend, that life is still life. Frank understood that instinctively. He didn't sit Bogie down and have a deep conversation about mortality. He didn't make Bogie's impending death the center of their time together. He just hung out with his friend, told jokes, argued about stupid shit, drank whiskey, laughed, and in doing that, he gave Bogie the rarest gift a dying man can receive: a few hours of not being dying. Humphrey Bogart was dying. Everyone knew it. The cancer was winning. The end was days away. But for 2 hours on that afternoon in January 1957, Frank Sinatra made sure that Bogie wasn't a dying man. He was just Bogie, still tough, still sardonic, still laughing at Frank's terrible jokes and giving it right back. And when Bogie died days later, one of his final good memories, one of his last moments of genuine joy, was sitting in his bedroom with Frank Sinatra, trading insults and dirty jokes like they'd done at 100 parties over the years. That's friendship. That's love. That's understanding that sometimes the greatest gift isn't what you say, but what you don't say. Not the goodbye you give, but the normalcy you provide. That's Frank Sinatra. Not the chairman of the board, not old Blue Eyes, not the voice, just Frank. A man who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is treating them exactly as you always have, even when everything has changed. Humphrey Bogart died knowing that at least one person still saw him as Bogie, and that person was Frank Sinatra.